So this is a great graph to show you where the money comes from. We'll look at this a little more closely in a second. In a second, where it all goes. This is our staff.
With their name tags on?
We don't have a statewide property tax. That's the importance of this little section. All income tax goes into public and higher education. Here's the reason we're talking about an imbalanced Utah tax structure. This is a key graph. We'll revisit this too. So the services we just showed, none of them are taxed. Okay, so that's our video. Now we've got a little slideshow. Okay, so we're talking about tax system reform, and that video was just to give you sort of an introduction as to how this works and why it works. So this is the critical slide that we showed as part of the video that really is illustrating what our problem is. Over time, in the last 20 plus years, you can see that the education fund, which is all income tax, individuals, corporations, all the income tax that comes to the state of Utah, goes into this silo, this fund that's earmarked only for public and higher education. Can't be used for anything else. You can see that orange line. The trend line is pretty good. You see it dip during the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009. But generally speaking, it's going pretty well. The income tax growth and revenue for the state of Utah is relatively healthy. The blue line, the general sales tax, the general fund rather, that comes from the sales tax is not so much. It used to be, and part of that is because we've changed the way we consume things. It used to be that we consumed a lot more goods than services relative to each other. And now, as time has gone on, we consume more services relative to goods. And the slide talked about some of those things, everything from ride-sharing services to lawn care to music sharing to legal services, healthcare, which is hugely growing at a great rate as amount of our state budget. Now that's taxed. We have sales tax on that. We have sales tax on the sale of goods. If you go and you can illustrate this by lawn mowing services in a fairly clear way. When we first bought our home 30 years ago, we generally, most people went out and bought their own mowers and bought their own gas and mowed their own lawns. It's much more common now that we hire somebody to come and do our lawn services. Now those people still have to buy mowers and gas, obviously, but they don't buy mowers to the same degree that we talk about buying mowers when you each had your own mower and each did your own lawn. Yeah.
What percentage of the sales tax decline would you say is due to untaxed interstate sales online?
That's a great question, and we don't know up until The Wayfair case, which was decided about a year ago, gave greater latitude to states to capture that revenue. We've always had an obligation to pay sales tax on our internet sales. It's just that individuals had the obligation to report it themselves, and we didn't do a very good job of doing it individually. And there was no effective mechanism by the state to come in and enforce that self-reporting. And it's not feasible to think that there ever could be. That's why the Wayfair decision was so important, is because now we say, we're giving the Supreme Court in that decision last year, gave the states the ability to direct laws at interstate internet sellers of goods and services to say, hey, you need to collect sales tax. So the answer to your question is, Thomas, I want to say Thomas Young is here, and Dr. Young, raise your hand. Thomas Young has a PhD and works in our Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office. And Dr. Young and others in our LFA, our Legislative Fiscal Analyst Office, have worked very hard to try to come up with numbers attached to the revenue that is going to be produced in the future from more effective collection of taxes on internet sales. Do you want to address that, Dr. Young, and tell us, what did you come up with in terms of what percentage of our declining sales tax revenue has in the past been due to internet sales activity that we have not captured the revenue on?
It looks like so far there was the Amazon agreement in 2017.
That was a voluntary agreement by Amazon reached with the state of Utah that they would begin to collect sales tax on all sales for Amazon products.
And that may be, looks like around 60 million each year in revenue from that. And then so far from the remote sales tax bill from the past special session, maybe 40 million has been collected. You know, it's early. So what is that?
So do you know, Thomas, Dr. Young, tell us, how's that going to change the trajectory of that blue line?
General sales tax to the general fund is around 2.1 billion. Income tax to the education fund is 4.5 billion. So
it's about 5%, an increase, an enhancement of about 5% on that blue line. It may shift the blue line and flatten it out more. I don't know, maybe it'll even start growing up. You need to know something that's important. Please understand this graph. These lines, that blue line doesn't mean that we're having decreasing revenue from sales tax. That is not happening. We're having increasing revenue from sales tax. But relative to the income that's coming into the state budget from income tax, it's lower. So what you're looking at here, the divergence between the orange and the blue lines, is the percentage share of the state budget. So it's not accurate to say that we're seeing decreasing revenue from sales tax. That's not accurate. It is accurate to say that we're seeing, relative to sales tax, increasing revenue from income tax and the education fund. And the significance of that is all that income tax money is earmarked, and the sales tax money is not. So it's putting a greater weight and a burden on the needs that we look to the revenue, the sales tax revenue in the general fund for. And that's the thing that makes people like Dr. Young nervous and makes me a little nervous as a policymaker and a budget maker. Mr. Wright.
I would say this graph it's misleading, and you just told us why it's misleading. The issue is not whether we're collecting a higher percentage of income versus sales tax. The issue is, are we collecting enough in each silo for that silo? Are we collecting enough education income? I don't know of anybody who really, outside of maybe somebody in the legislature, who thinks we're spending too much money on education.
Yeah. Oh, you're so cold and brutal. What's this? What did you point the finger at me? You gotta point the finger at this guy with the argument and say, the D's want to see more money.
And as far as general sales tax and transportation tax, I think you need to look at those silos and say, for roads, are we collecting enough road-related taxes for the other things that the sales tax is currently supporting? Are we collecting enough sales-related taxes for those requirements that we have? One thing everybody likes is free stuff from the government. We got to pay for it. If you get The only way to run our government is decide what services you want and decide how you're going to pay for it. And these silos, I think, are okay. They're unbalanced because we've allowed them to become unbalanced.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you for that comment. Yeah.
So can you just explain to me the difference between education income versus the money we get from property taxes for
Yeah,
students?
sure. Thank you for that question. It's a good question. The slideshow or the video mentioned that property taxes are all assessed at the local level. By local, I mean county or city or school district. And a significant portion, not all of them, but a significant portion of those property taxes are used to fund public education. There's a significant component that's levied by state or rather local school districts and kept in that school district. That's one of the reasons that Park City School District is by far the most generously funded public school district in the States, because a lot of second homes, a lot of highly valued properties, relatively low burden in terms of the number of kids per dollar raised for property taxes, because of, again, second, third homes, things like that. So, not all, by any means, of the property taxes are used for public education, but a large percentage of them are. And not all of our public education dollars come from property taxes, but there's a component of local property taxes that's used for our public education system, and it's supplemented by our state property or state income tax that's used for public education and higher education too. We talk about the weighted pupil unit, the WPU. That's just the way in which state budget makers have come up with a uniform unit of measurement to determine, to evaluate how much money we're spending per student on public education. WPU is just for public education as opposed to higher education, which is tuition and things like that. Yeah.
Oh, Brian, are you going to show this in any other way? Because in essence, this has to add up to 100.
100?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh, that's right. And
So if education income tax, for example, tripled, it would look like general sales tax went flew to zero.
yeah, that's right.
So are we going to see this any other way?
I don't know, I can't remember. Can't remember what's on the slideshow. We'll see.
right, well-
But there, no, I take your point in the sense that there are a lot of ways of looking at this and evaluating it, and we need to continue, as Dr. Young said, we are looking at a state education budget in the form of the education fund from income tax of between 4 and 5 billion. Is that right, Thomas? And the sales tax number is significantly less than that, just because, you know, this is the divergence that we're talking about in that road. But it's a huge amount of money, like $2.5 billion.
So in the end, as Glenn said, it comes back to what do we want to spend our money on?
And where do you want it to come from?
And where's it going to come from?
That's right.
Right.
No, you're right. And one of the things that I say to people when I talk about the budget, it's the most important thing that we do at the legislature. It's the only constitutionally mandated thing that we do is put a budget together. We don't have to do anything when we get into session other than that. Put the budget together. It's got to be balanced. We could do that and then go home. There's no requirement that we pass bills that address the statutes.
And there's no requirement.
What?
Can we do that for a year or two?
No, we don't have that kind of restraint.
And there's no requirement to comply with the public referendum.
No, you could, well, we saw that. The proposition's passed, and we said, we'll do what we want. And look, I mean, I have heartburn about that in some ways, but in some ways I can defend tweaking propositions that were passed because they need to be tweaked. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But when we're talking about the budget, our priorities, I can rephrase what you're saying in another way. Our priorities as legislators are reflected very clearly in how we choose to spend taxpayer money. And our priorities are also reflected in where we get that taxpayer money from, what decisions we make about we're going to raise revenue by raising tax rates here or lowering tax rates there or expanding taxes to previously untaxed activity someplace else. So it's complex and it's interesting and it reflects, it's something that if Utahns and every citizen knew more about, I think they'd care more in terms of making decisions about who to vote for based on those kind of priorities. But it's dry, wonky stuff. It's not got the sex appeal that a lot of hot button issues do. A couple of other things before we move on. We're way off track in terms of time here. That purple line is the local property taxes. So you can see there's a significant amount of money that is raised for the Utah state budget that comes from local property taxes. But it's not nearly as much as the education fund that comes from income tax. Transportation taxes come from, or rather fuel taxes come from, are used for transportation. They're earmarked for transportation. They come from what you pay at the pump. And we've made quite a few changes in that over the last 5 years or so. We raised the fuel tax significantly. We put in place, as you know, many of you anyway, a increased tax each year on electric vehicles in light of the fact that when electric vehicle owners don't pay their fair share of the money necessary to maintain our roads because they don't buy tax or they don't buy gas and fuel in the same proportion that non-electric vehicle owners do. Okay, so what are the options to deal with these challenges that we face? Well, we can do nothing. And some people say that. They say, look, let this ride out, let this play out. We talk about the sales tax. Somebody, you raised that question about how much are we going to collect in sales tax. Some people say, we really don't know how much we're going to collect. And so we ought to let that stabilize before we make any decisions based on that divergence in numbers when we just took some action and we're in the process of taking action to raise more money in the sales tax and in the general fund. Or there are other reasons for saying do nothing. We can modify the existing system, we can implement a new system of taxation, or some combination of those things. And in all likelihood, that last thing is what you're going to end up seeing to some degree or another over time is a combination of either modifying the existing system or expanding the tax base to previously untaxed services or other products or activity, economic activity. Here's on the right-hand side are some possible tax options, and we'll go through them in more detail in each one of these next slides. So we can broaden the sales tax and have it be sort of a consumption tax in the sense that we do a better job of taxing services that are now untaxed. This is something that in talking to Jonathan Ball, who is Dr. Young's boss, and is a resident of Sonoma County, by the way. He's the head of our legislative fiscal analyst office, and I was talking to him about the slideshow before we started these town hall meetings, and he said, Brian, this is what, if you say one thing, if you convey one thing to people across the state in doing this presentation, it's this. This is what I'd like you to say. Over the last 40 or 50 years, there are all sorts of activities that have developed and that have flourished that we used to not tax at all, and we still don't tax, but they've become a bigger and bigger portion of what we do in terms of our economic activity, the wealth that they create for people, the satisfaction that they give others in consuming those things. You've got to make a decision as a policymaker up at the Capitol, I'm telling you, with my hat on as the head of legislative fiscal analyst and your chief budget advisor, you've got to make a decision about whether you want that to continue or not. Because if you allow it to continue, that's fine, but you're basically strangling the general fund and the sales tax. I get that point. And that's one of the things that HB 441, sponsored by my good friend, Representative Tim Quinn, where he represents, let me think of this, he represents someplace right around here. He was the sponsor of a bill that would have put that whole thing, expanded that whole base. And look, I kid Tim, he's a good friend. My hat's off to Tim for taking this on. This is a tough issue, and it doesn't have a lot of upside politically, quite honestly. And my hat's off to the speaker, to the president, for their willingness to support it and taking it on, and to the governor talking about it. I think we needed to educate people about why we were doing it, and that's part of what we're doing tonight. More before we jumped right into the middle of it in the last session. But I do appreciate the fact that we're talking about it more. It's important that we do that. If we did increase this taxation of services in the way that HB 441 would have done, it would have added an enormous amount of economic activity to the tax base for the state of Utah. It would have added greater stability. You can say what you like, you can say you don't like it, it's a terrible idea, or you can say it's a great idea, but the reality is that from a fiscal analyst perspective, the Jonathan Ball perspectives of the world, when he's advising us, he says, one thing it would give you is greater stability and greater predictability for the future in terms of what money comes into the state tax base. And that's what that first bullet point represents. One of the things, this is separate, the second bullet point is separate from taxing services. A sales tax on grocery food. Right now, the sales tax on grocery food is lower than the regular sales tax for other goods. It's 1.7. The regular sales tax for other goods is 4.85. If you took that sales tax on groceries back up to 4.85, it would generate a lot of money, about $250 million a year. You can disagree about whether that's a good idea or not. I have strong feelings about it. Stand right here, Tim Quinn has strong feelings about it. We happen to be on the same side of it. We think it's a bad idea to eliminate that.
One of us ran a bill to do something about it.
But we're not the only voices in the room on this. And there are a lot of folks particularly on Tim's side of the aisle, who say we need to take that sales tax on groceries back up to 4.85. We'll see how that plays out. I don't know whether we'll have a bill on that or not, but I anticipate we're going to have a fight about that very issue in upcoming sessions. The third bullet point, shared economy, shifting tastes and preferences. This is the point that Jonathan Hall wanted me to make and I talked about. So if you do this, what we're talking about here, the people that would be currently impacted, industries and businesses that would be impacted are currently untaxed services and economic sectors. It's important that people understand that. And they do many times, and that's why they're so unhappy. They were so unhappy about HB 441, and why it's relatively controversial. Next. So this just talks about that in a little more detail. There's a list on the left side of various services and industries that aren't taxed right now. And there are also a lot of tax exemptions for things that you would think would be taxed but aren't. Let me give you an example. Several decades ago, I think it was in the 80s or 90s, some of the airlines came to the legislature and said, you know what, we really want to do more business in Utah, and it would help us make that decision easier in favor of doing more business in Utah if you would put an exemption in place for sales tax on fuel sales for our airlines in Utah. And the legislature, rightly or wrongly, you can say that this is a good thing or a bad thing. They made the decision, okay, we're going to do that. We lose about, now tell me if I'm right about this, Dr. Young, because I saw some statistics about this just before we started today that I wasn't aware of with the specificity that I saw before this meeting. We lose about $250 million a year in money that would otherwise come into the state treasury in sales tax revenue on fuel sales for the airlines that we don't tax. Again, you can say, well, that's the cost of having a hub from Delta Airlines in Salt Lake, and that's a good thing, and we're building a new airport, we bring a lot of people in, yada, yada, yada. And you can say, it's terrible. We call it special interest legislation. We call it, you can call it whatever you want to call it. But that's the reality, that the stuff over here on the right-hand side of the column are exemptions for various sales activity of goods that would, or products that would otherwise be subject to taxation. And those exemptions add up to about $1 billion a year. $1 billion a year total. The biggest single one is that fuel and jet tax exemption I was talking about earlier. But there are a lot of them. There are a lot of them. Okay, next. We can, this just goes along, talks about the same thing. And here's the other one on eliminating exemptions. We have a lot of exemptions that this is a more significant, specific list of, not significant, but a more specific list of some of those exemptions that we're talking about. And you can see I said $1 billion, it's a little less than that. It's $906,841,900. I don't know how they come up with that specific number, but that's what we've got. Here's another option to deal with this. You can raise the rates, and I think that's, to some extent,